Good evening. I'm Velshi in for Chris Matthews. It rained in Washington today a lot. These are the scenes in the nation's capital where a flash flood emergency was issued. Flights were canceled, motorists stranded, even the White House basement was flooded. In short, it was a total mess, and that is why I am anchoring Hardball tonight. Chris Matthews was supposed to be in Washington, but his flight was delayed and delayed and delayed again. So he'll be back tomorrow. In the meantime, we've got a lot of news to get to. Federal prosecutors unsealed an indictment against Jeffrey Epstein on the charge of sex trafficking women, some as young as 14. The wealthy financier once palled around with Donald Trump and Bill Clinton, among other powerful figures. At the end of the hour, the extraordinary public battle between Speaker Nancy Pelosi and some of the Democratic Party's most well-known liberals, including Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. But we begin with some big 2020 news. Former Vice President Joe Biden is trying to put to rest the controversy over his remarks about working with Southern segregationist senators in the 1970s. After 3 weeks of resisting calls to apologize, he did just that at an event in the critical early primary state of South Carolina on Saturday.
Folks, now was I wrong a few weeks ago to somehow give the impression to people that I was praising those men who I successfully opposed time and again? Well, yes, I was. I regret it. And I'm sorry for any of the pain or misconception they may have caused anybody.
Meanwhile, a new poll found Biden, still the Democratic frontrunner, to be the only Democrat with a clear lead over President Trump in a head-to-head matchup. The Washington Post ABC News poll shows Biden beating President Trump by 10 points among registered voters. Now, Senators Bernie Sanders and Kamala Harris narrowly defeat President Trump in a head-to-head matchup. Elizabeth Warren and Pete Buttigieg run even with him. The same poll also showed President Trump's job approval rating rising to the highest point in his presidency, 47% among registered voters, and that's up from 42% back in April. Meanwhile, the crowded Democratic field got just a little less crowded today. California Congressman Eric Swalwell became the first candidate to bow out. He said he's returning to Washington to focus on his work on the House Intelligence and Judiciary Committees. For more on all this, I'm joined by Robert Costa, national political reporter for The Washington Post, Neera Tanden, CEO of the Center for American Progress, and Jason Johnson, politics editor for TheRoot.com. Welcome to all of you. Thank you for being with us.
Good to be here, Ollie.
Listen, a short time ago on Meet the Press Daily, my colleague Steve Kornacki asked Joe Biden's deputy campaign manager, Kate Bedingfield, why Biden's apology took so long. Let's listen.
Well, look, I think there were two takeaways from this weekend. One is that he's somebody who listens and hears. And when he felt like an apology was owed, he had no problem making one. You heard him make a forceful case for, the fact that, look, he has been in public life for many years. And you know what? He's been at the forefront of change. He's been at the forefront of making change in this country. And you're going to hear him talk about that. But he's also not going to allow anybody to mischaracterize or take his record out of context.
Neera Tanden, do you buy the explanation and the apology?
I think the apology is definitely one thing. I do think a lot of the energy in this exchange was about the issue of actually seeming to sanction racist and segregationist views. And I think it is actually really important that the vice president spoke out and said he was sorry and wrong about that. And I don't think it really answers the question as to why he didn't do this before the debate. I do think they probably think it would have been better to do this before the debate, so he didn't leave this space open for Kamala Harris. But I also think you see from Cory Booker and some other campaigns that they'd like to move on. And this will be a question of whether the vice president can successfully pivot and move on to other issues. He does have this other good pull for him, or whether he continues to talk about this in a way that puts him on the defensive.
Jason Johnson?
He dropped 10 points. I mean, he dropped 10 points in almost every single post-debate #2 poll. That's the only reason Joe Biden apologize. When he spoke to Reverend Al Sharpton in South Carolina, when he did other interviews afterwards, he was fiercely defensive. He insisted he did nothing wrong, but when those polls came out, he realized, oh my gosh, I cannot keep this position. I don't think Joe Biden has learned his lesson. He is still a front runner, but he's got work to do. And you can't spend 3 weeks in American politics before you recognize that you make a mistake. You need to address that mistake, because if he was a true front runner, he would have been able to spend this in 48 hours and we wouldn't still be talking about it a week and a half later.
So, Robert Costa, insofar as everybody agrees it took him too long to do it, has he put it behind him by doing it?
This is a candidate who began his campaign with a video calling out President Trump's response to the tragedy in Charlottesville. He began his race by talking about the issue of race in this country. And you have a candidate now who's trying to bring the conversation back to his time with President Obama, the 8 years as vice president, and not get bogged down in talking about his long record in the Senate. And Senator Harris, like a prosecutor politically, came at him talking about busing. His aides even admit for Vice President Biden, he fumbled the response. He did take too long. He finally did apologize for his response. But the more his aides say privately, he's talking about the Senate years and not the VP years, the more he's going to face these sorts of challenges.
So as for the VP years, former First Lady Michelle Obama was asked for her thoughts about the confrontation between Biden and Kamala Harris on Saturday night at the Essence Music Festival in New Orleans. Let's watch.
What, if anything, would you like to say about the Kamala Biden dust-up? He apologized today. You've been following that. Do you have any thoughts about that?
I do not.
Okay.
Neera, what does that tell you about the future, that she had no comment?
I think that the Obamas have made a decision to stay out of the primary for a while. I think the Barack Obama, President Obama says pretty regularly that the vice presidential pick was one of his best picks, but that's pretty much where they've left it. And I think the one thing I would say about the vice president is I think he has made an electability argument, and this Washington Post poll really helps him. I think a lot of people thought he would drop against Trump after the debate performance, and the fact that he didn't, at least in that poll, it is only one poll, does give his campaign, I think, a little bit of an ability to reset. But I think Jason Johnson is right that, you know, politics is unforgiving these days, and he has to have better performances in the next debate and the other exchanges to come.
So, Jason, Biden does well as of now amongst African-American voters. Having Barack Obama's endorsement would make him do more well, but Barack Obama and Michelle Obama do not seem to be willing to go out on a limb for Joe Biden, particularly now.
Right, and they shouldn't. They shouldn't. I mean, Michelle Obama's response is basically sips tea, I have nothing to say, right? And she's not going to. And here's what's key, though, Ali. Guess what would have been more important than an endorsement? Had Joe Biden been there? You have the Essence Fest in New Orleans. It's one of the largest collections of African-American women of all classes, levels, and education sizes. And Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders, there were critical candidates who weren't there. He can't put on this Obama mask and think that that's going to allow him to skirt through. He's got to be out talking to the kinds of voters that matters. And African-American women are the backbone by turnout and interest and passion in the Democratic Party. Joe Biden's got to fix that problem on his own.
All right, Michigan Congressman Justin Amash, this is new, is not ruling out running for president. In a July 4th op-ed in the Washington Post, Amash declared his independence from the Republican Party. He criticized both parties, saying the two-party system has evolved into an existential threat to American principles and institutions. Now, Amash had been the only Republican in Congress to support an impeachment inquiry into President Trump. In an interview on Sunday, he was asked what he's heard privately from Republicans about his decision to leave the party.
When I was discussing impeachment, I had fellow colleagues and other Republicans, high-level officials, contacting me saying, thank you for what you're doing. So there are lots of Republicans out there who are saying these things privately, but they're not saying it publicly. And I think that's a problem for our country.
Obviously, Robert, President Trump came out and tweeted all sorts of nasty things about Justin Amash and being a loser and whatever the case is. And normally, nobody knows who Justin Amash is, and running for president wouldn't be a threat to anyone except the guys from Michigan.
And that's one of the key states for President Trump in 2020. It's one of the 5 or 6 states in 2016 that he had a very narrow margin of votes, and if he wants to win the White House again, he has to do well in a state like Michigan. For the last few months, William Weld, the former Massachusetts governor, has been running in the Republican primary against President Trump. He's been the only place for that anti-Trump Republican voter to go. The problem for the White House, they don't think Amash's candidacy, if he runs for president, would be a nuisance nationally. But they wonder, even if he got traction in a few of these states like Michigan, a few thousand votes, 5 or 10% even, could that hurt the president's path to re-election? So he's a threat in that sense, even if he's not a major contender in any way.
Neera, what do you make of this?
You know, I am glad that he came out for impeachment, but I have to say that, I mean, we've gone years of Republicans saying they're concerned and anxious, and I just have a hard time relying on any Republican to put up on this stuff. And so I hope he actually follows through with his principles, but generally they all tend to cave in the end.
Jason?
Yeah, I don't see how you win the game if you take your ball and go home. Look, if Justin Amash really wanted to make that much of a difference, he would stay in the Republican Party and he would continue to light a fire under the butts of his colleagues and tell them that they need to stand up for American sovereignty and address the fact that you have a president who is possibly engaged in impeachable offenses. So quitting the party, that doesn't impress me one way or another. If he decides that he wants to run, it's absolutely immaterial. The only way that any Republican running against Donald Trump in the primary in 2020 would potentially matter is if he had to stand on the debate stage and actually face other Republicans who say you should be impeached. That would be interesting. That might possibly affect some of the never-Trumpers out there. But as a practical matter, no one knew who Justin Amash was before this, and now that he doesn't have the Republican machine behind him, no one will remember him again.
All right, you guys, the warm-up is over. Put your thinking caps on for this one. This one's going to be tough. President Trump today tweeted out what appeared to be a quote from former President Ronald Reagan praising Donald Trump. It showed an actual photo of the two together, but the quote attributed to Reagan was fake. It reads, "For the life of me, and I'll never know how to explain it, when I met that young man, I felt like I was the one shaking hands with the president." All right, the account that originally posted that quote has since been suspended. A Reagan library official confirmed the quote was false. The website PolitiFact called it a, quote, pants on fire lie. Neera.
I mean, we have so many pants on fire lies. One could ask, why do you have a president so insecure that he would need to lie and make up a quote by a former Republican president about himself? But this is just one of the myriad insanities of the Trump age.
It does, Robert, make you wonder, and you have wondered about this, and I'm sure you've investigated it. Does he just do this stuff, or is it his people?
Well, it's hard to say, but look, the president has been praised in the past by Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon notably wrote a letter to then businessman Donald Trump saying Mrs. Nixon really enjoyed meeting him. He really enjoyed meeting him. But President Reagan never wrote such a note. There is a photo that's signed by President Reagan. But this is, again, the president using social media in a way that's not checking the facts, that's not accurate, but he really seeks that adulation, and he likes to spread the idea that he's popular online. It's nothing new. It's a shame that something that's not accurate would get such public disbursement, but it's not a surprise in terms of his political tactics.
Jason, you're a younger man than I am, but you're old enough to remember a time when that kind of thing would have been embarrassing and would have been cause for a statement and might have chastened someone. But this doesn't matter anymore, does it?
No, it doesn't. And I'm thinking back to that brilliant quote from Abraham Lincoln when he was posting on Instagram and said, "Don't believe everything you see on the internet." Look, I mean, this is the kind of thing that happens all the time, right? People don't read. They don't pay attention to history. And so, therefore, anything the president tweets out, people get excited about it. But it's indicative of the lowering of standards that we have that's pretty much been caused by this president.
Yeah.
Also, the president benefits by never having any shame. Donald Trump doesn't experience the emotion of shame.
I often wonder what life would be like that, Neera.
So he's able to do these things that actually any normal human being would feel some degree of shame over.
It's the end of shame. Great to see the three of you. Thank you for helping us get this kicked off. Robert Costa, Neera Tanden, and Jason Johnson.